Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in quietly, science takes its shoes off at the door, and questions are allowed to unfold at their own unhurried pace. This is a place for wandering thoughts, for explanations that don't rush to impress, and for ideas that feel more like conversations than conclusions. Tonight's journey begins with something most of us notice every single day, often without thinking too hard about it. Something we recognise instantly, and yet rarely stop to examine with any real care. It begins with a human face. Faces are strange things when you really sit with them. We recognise thousands over a lifetime. We notice the smallest shifts in expression, the faintest changes in mood, the subtle signs of familiarity or difference. Long before we learn language, before we understand maps or history or culture, our brains are already busy studying faces, learning what is familiar, what is new, what belongs and what does not. And among all the features that make up a face, the eyes seem to carry a special weight. We look to them for emotion, for intention, for connection. We read entire stories in a glance, even when we shouldn't. So tonight we're going to slow down and look gently, carefully, and without hurry at a question that is often asked casually, sometimes awkwardly, and too often poorly explained. Why do Asian eye shapes look so different? Not different as in separate from humanity, not different as in unusual or exotic, but different in the simple, biological sense that variation exists. Variation that has been shaped over long stretches of time by geography, climate, migration, genetics and chance. Variation that tells a story, if we're willing to listen to it without assumptions. Before we go any further, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? A bedroom with the lights low, a long drive under a dark sky, a quiet apartment where the day has finally loosened its grip. And what time is it for you in this moment? It's fitting, really. A conversation about human variation, unfolding across time zones, across continents, across lives that all arrived here at slightly different moments, yet somehow share this same stretch of sound. If you find this kind of gentle exploration soothing, or if it gives your mind something calm to rest against as the day fades, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner reach others who might need something steady and thoughtful to listen to as they wind down. Now, let's begin carefully, because this topic deserves care. When people talk about Asian eye shapes, they're usually referring to a feature called the epicanthic fold, a fold of skin that can cover the inner corner of the eye. But even starting there, things already become more complicated than the casual phrase suggests. Asia is not a single place. It is the largest and most diverse continent on Earth, home to thousands of ethnic groups, languages, climates and histories. From the frozen tundra of Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, from the high plateaus of Central Asia to the coastal regions of East Asia, human populations have adapted to environments that could hardly be more different from one another. And faces, like all parts of the human body, carry traces of those long adaptations. The idea that there is one Asian eye shape is more a shortcut of perception than a biological reality. Some people of East Asian descent have prominent epicanthic folds, some have subtle ones, some have none at all. The same is true for people from Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe and indigenous populations of the Americas. This feature is not exclusive, not uniform, and not fixed. It exists on a spectrum, shaped by many influences layered over tens of thousands of years. But human brains, efficient as they are, love categories. They simplify, they group, they take vast complexity and compress it into manageable patterns. This is useful when identifying faces quickly, but it becomes a problem when those patterns turn into assumptions, when difference becomes a label instead of a story, when a feature becomes a stereotype instead of a clue. To understand why certain eye shapes became more common in some populations, we need to step far back, long before borders, long before nations, long before the word Asia meant anything at all. We need to imagine small groups of humans moving across landscapes that were often harsh, unpredictable and demanding. Cold winds sweeping across open plains, bright sunlight reflecting off snow and ice, seasonal scarcity that shaped not just culture, but bodies themselves. One leading explanation for the prevalence of epicanthic folds in some populations relates to environmental protection. In colder, windier climates, with high exposure to snow glare and dry air, a fold of skin around the eye may have helped reduce irritation, retain moisture, and shield the eye from the elements. This isn't about beauty or design. It's about survival in specific conditions, repeated generation after generation, until small advantages quietly became common traits. But biology is never driven by a single cause. Genetics rarely works that way. Traits don't appear because the environment demands them directly, like tools pulled from a box. Instead, random variations already present in a population become more or less common, depending on whether they help or hinder survival and reproduction in a given setting. Over long periods of time, those tiny statistical shifts add up. Faces change. Bodies change. Not because anyone intended them to, but because life continues. Another piece of the story lies in early human migration. When small groups split off and move into new regions, they carry only a portion of the genetic variation of the original population. This is known as a founder effect. Over time, isolated populations develop distinct features simply because certain traits happen to be more common among the people who settled there. Not because those traits were superior, but because they were present. This is one reason why similar eye features can appear in populations that are geographically distant but historically connected. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, for example, often show epicanthic folds, reflecting ancient migration patterns from East Asia across the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years ago. The feature travelled with people, not with continents. It's also important to understand that eye shape is influenced by multiple genes interacting in complex ways. There is no single eye shape gene. Small differences in bone structure, fat distribution, muscle attachment, and skin thickness all play a role. These differences develop during early fetal growth, long before birth, guided by genetic instructions that vary subtly from person to person. Even siblings can have noticeably different eye shapes. And then there is culture, which often gets tangled up with biology in confusing ways. For centuries, Western societies tried to impose rigid classifications on human variation, often ranking features instead of understanding them. Pseudoscientific ideas about race treated physical traits as markers of worth or intelligence. Ideas that have long since been discredited but still leave echoes in how people talk and think today. Eye shape, unfortunately, became one of those misused markers. This is why conversations like this matter. Not to isolate or exoticize, but to explain. To replace vague assumptions with grounded understanding. To remind ourselves that every human face is the result of countless ancestors adapting, surviving, and passing along what worked well enough to continue. No feature exists in isolation. No trait tells a full story on its own. When people say eye shape, they usually feel as though they're pointing to something obvious, something immediately visible and easily described. It sounds straightforward, almost tidy, as if the phrase refers to a single, well-defined feature that can be named, sorted, and understood at a glance. But the moment you slow down and look a little more carefully, that simplicity starts to unravel. Eye shape is not one thing. It's not even a single category of things. It's a layered collection of structures, tissues, movements, and proportions that work together so seamlessly that we mistake the result for something singular. At the most basic level, the eye itself, the globe that allows us to see, is remarkably similar in all humans. The eyeball is nearly the same size across populations, with only tiny variations that have little to do with what people usually mean when they talk about eye shape. What we perceive as eye shape comes almost entirely from the structures around the eye, not the eye itself. The eyelids, the folds of skin, the distribution of fat, the shape of the surrounding bone, the angle at which everything sits on the face. All of these elements combine to create what we casually label with one short phrase. The upper eyelid alone introduces more complexity than most people realise. Some individuals have a visible crease in the upper eyelid that appears when the eyes are open. Others have a crease that is partially hidden. Some have no visible crease at all. This variation exists across the world and within families, and it's influenced by how the levator muscle attaches to the skin of the eyelid during development. That attachment point can vary slightly, leading to noticeable differences in appearance without changing the function of the eye in any meaningful way. Then there is the epicanthic fold, a feature that often becomes the focal point of these conversations. This is a fold of skin that can cover the inner corner of the eye, sometimes partially, sometimes more prominently. It can make the eye opening appear narrower or differently shaped, even though the eye itself is not smaller. The presence, absence, or degree of this fold varies widely, and it does not appear exclusively in one population or region. It shows up in infants of many backgrounds, often becoming less pronounced with age, and it appears in adults across different parts of the world. Bone structure adds another layer. The shape of the orbital rim, the ridge of bone around the eye socket, affects how deep set or prominent the eyes appear. Slight differences in the cheekbones and the nasal bridge can change the visual balance of the entire eye area. These skeletal features are influenced by genetics, nutrition and development, and they interact with soft tissues in ways that make each face unique. Two people can have similar eyelids, but look entirely different because the surrounding bone structure frames the eyes differently. Fat distribution plays a role as well, particularly in the upper eyelid and the area just beneath the brow. Small variations in where fat pads sit can affect whether the eyelid looks smooth, folded, or rounded. These differences are subtle, but our brains are extremely good at detecting subtlety in faces. We notice differences even when we can't articulate what exactly is different. This is one reason why the phrase eye shape persists. It feels like a convenient explanation for something we sense intuitively, but haven't been taught to describe accurately. Movement matters too. The way eyelids move when someone blinks, smiles, or looks to the side changes how eye shape is perceived in real time. Facial expressions reshape the eye area constantly. Muscles contract and relax, skin shifts, and folds appear and disappear. What we think of as a static feature is actually dynamic, changing from moment to moment depending on emotion, lighting, fatigue, and focus. A person's eyes can appear quite different in a photograph compared to how they look in conversation, which adds another layer of illusion to the idea of fixed shapes. Lighting and context influence perception more than we usually acknowledge. Shadows emphasize folds, bright light flattens contours. The angle from which we view a face can exaggerate or minimize certain features. Cultural exposure also trains our eyes to notice particular details while overlooking others. If you grow up seeing a wide range of faces, variation feels normal and unremarkable. If your exposure is limited, differences can feel larger than they are, simply because they are unfamiliar. Language complicates things further. When we rely on broad terms to describe physical traits, we compress complexity into labels that were never designed to carry that much meaning. Eye shape becomes a stand-in for a cluster of features we don't have everyday words for. Over time, those labels pick up cultural baggage. They start to imply categories that feel fixed and essential, even though the underlying biology is fluid and overlapping. It's also worth noticing how early these perceptions form. Humans begin recognizing and distinguishing faces within the first months of life. Infants show preferences for familiar facial patterns, not because those patterns are inherently better or more important, but because familiarity feels safe. As we grow, those early tendencies are reinforced by social cues, media representation, and the stories we're told, both explicitly and implicitly, about what differences mean. The danger is not in noticing variation. Noticing is natural. The problem arises when noticing turns into simplifying, and simplifying turns into assuming. When a complex set of anatomical traits gets reduced to a single phrase, it becomes easy to forget that we are talking about normal human variation shaped by time, environment, and chance, rather than something that needs special explanation or justification. Another layer often overlooked is how much variation exists within any group people try to describe. Two individuals from the same family can have markedly different eye features. Identical twins, who share nearly all of their genetic material, can still show small differences due to how development unfolds in the womb. When we step back and look at entire populations, the overlap becomes even more obvious. There is no clean line where one eye shape ends and another begins. Medical and anatomical fields tend to avoid overly broad descriptors for this reason. They focus instead on specific structures and functions. In everyday conversation, though, we default to shorthand. That shorthand isn't inherently wrong, but it becomes misleading when it's treated as precise or definitive. Eye shape is an impression, not a measurement. It's a summary our brains create, not a single trait encoded neatly in DNA. Modern cosmetic practices offer an interesting lens into this complexity. Procedures that alter eyelids, for example, don't create a single standardized look. Results vary widely depending on the individual's existing anatomy. This variability highlights how many factors are involved in shaping the eye area. It also shows how cultural preferences influence which features people pay attention to, sometimes reinforcing the idea that certain variations are deviations rather than natural outcomes of diversity. There's also a historical component to how these ideas formed. Early attempts to classify human populations often relied on superficial features, because those were the most immediately visible. Without a solid understanding of genetics, migration, or development, observers drew conclusions that felt logical at the time but were deeply flawed. Those conclusions filtered into popular language and lingered long after the science moved on. Today we have a far better understanding of how traits develop and why variation exists, but language and habit tend to lag behind knowledge. We still use old shortcuts because they're familiar, even when they don't reflect what we now know to be true. That gap between understanding and expression is part of why conversations about physical difference can feel awkward or incomplete. As we continue, it helps to hold this complexity in mind. Eye shape is not a single switch flipped one way or another. It's the outcome of many small influences interacting over time. It's anatomy, development, perception, and culture all layered together. When we talk about it as if it was simple, we lose the chance to understand what it actually represents, and this matters, not because we need to catalogue faces more accurately, but because how we talk about physical traits shapes how we think about people. When we allow ourselves to see features as part of a long, ordinary human story, rather than as markers of separation, the conversation changes. It becomes quieter, more grounded, and less loaded with assumptions. When we say the word Asia, it often lands in the mind as a single place, a single idea, almost a single image. That's how language works when it tries to compress something vast into something manageable. One word, 5 letters, easy to say, easy to place on a map. But the reality behind that word is so large, so layered, and so varied that the label itself almost immediately begins to fail the moment we ask it to do any real descriptive work. Asia is not just big in the sense of landmass, although it is the largest continent on Earth by a wide margin. It is big in time, in climate, in population history, and in the sheer number of different human lives that have unfolded across it. To understand why one word can never describe one look, it helps to first let go of the idea that physical traits neatly follow modern borders or cultural categories. Human bodies did not evolve according to continents as we name them today. They evolved according to mountains, rivers, deserts, coastlines, ice sheets, forests, and long stretches of land where movement was either easy or nearly impossible. Asia contains all of these, often stacked right beside one another. In some places, a few hundred kilometres can separate tropical heat from alpine cold, dense jungle from open steppe, humid coastlines from arid plateaus. Each of these environments quietly shaped the people who lived there generation after generation without intention or awareness. Consider the northern reaches of Asia, where winters can be long, dark and brutally cold. Siberia stretches across thousands of kilometres, with temperatures that can drop far below what most humans ever experience. Wind, snow, glare, low humidity, and extreme seasonal variation define daily life for tens of thousands of years. Now contrast that with Southeast Asia, where warmth and humidity dominate, where sunlight filters through dense vegetation, and where survival depended on very different adaptations. The human populations living in these regions did not face the same pressures, did not eat the same foods, did not move through the same terrain, and did not experience the same risks. Expecting their physical features to converge into a single look ignores how deeply environment shapes variation. Then there is East Asia, with its long coastlines, fertile river valleys, and historically dense populations. Agriculture developed early in some regions, leading to more stable settlements and different patterns of movement compared to nomadic or semi-nomadic groups elsewhere. Central Asia, by contrast, is defined by vast open steppe, where mobility was essential and cultures were shaped by herding, seasonal travel, and wide-ranging interaction between groups. South Asia adds yet another layer, with its own complex mix of climates, from Himalayan highlands to tropical plains, and a population history that includes some of the oldest continuous settlements on Earth. Each of these regions hosted not just one population, but many. Over tens of thousands of years, humans moved, mixed, separated, and moved again. Some groups stayed relatively isolated due to geography, while others became crossroads of migration and trade. Mountain ranges like the Himalayas acted as both barriers and filters, slowing movement in some directions while channeling it in others. Deserts limited travel but also preserved distinct populations. Coastlines encouraged fishing, seafaring, and exchange. None of this happened evenly, and none of it produced uniform outcomes. When people speak casually about Asian features, they're often unknowingly blending traits that arose in very different contexts. The epicanthic fold, for example, appears in some East Asian and Northeast Asian populations, but it is far less common in many parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia. Even within East Asia, its frequency and appearance vary widely. Meanwhile, facial features such as nose shape, jaw structure, and cheekbone prominence show enormous diversity across the continent. Skin tone alone spans a wide spectrum, influenced by latitude, sun exposure, and genetic history. It's also important to remember that Asia has been home to humans for a very long time. Modern humans were present in parts of Asia tens of thousands of years ago, and in some regions, human ancestors lived there far earlier. That long timeline allowed for both continuity and change. Some traits persisted because they worked well enough. Others shifted as populations mixed or environments changed. Climate itself was not stable over this period. Ice ages came and went, sea levels rose and fell, forests expanded and retreated. Human groups adapted again and again, sometimes staying in place, sometimes moving on. One reason the idea of a single Asian appearance persists is historical perspective. For many people outside Asia, exposure to Asian faces came through limited channels, trade routes, colonial encounters, early photography, and later, film and television. Those channels often highlighted specific regions or groups, not the full range of diversity. Over time, repeated exposure to a narrow subset of faces created a mental shortcut, a pattern that felt familiar even if it was incomplete. Once that pattern took hold, it became easy to mistake familiarity for representativeness. There is also a psychological tendency at work. Humans are very good at noticing differences between groups they consider unfamiliar, while perceiving greater variation within groups they see as their own. This isn't malicious, it's a quirk of perception. When you're deeply familiar with a set of faces, you notice small distinctions. When you're less familiar, your brain emphasizes shared features and overlooks nuance. Over time, this can lead to the impression that people from a large and diverse area all look the same, even though that impression collapses under closer attention. Geography also shapes how populations interact. In parts of Asia, long-standing trade networks connected distant regions, allowing genes, ideas and customs to travel together. The Silk Road is one well-known example, but it was not a single road. It was a network of routes that linked East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East and Europe. Along these routes, people intermarried, settled and moved on. Faces changed slowly as a result, blending traits over time. In coastal regions, maritime trade created similar patterns, connecting islands and shorelines across vast distances. At the same time, some regions remained relatively isolated. Island populations, highland communities, and groups living in difficult terrain often had fewer outside contacts. In those settings, certain traits became more common simply because the gene pool was smaller and more stable. This does not make those traits more authentic or more ancient. It simply reflects how population size and movement affect genetic variation. Over many generations, small differences can become visually noticeable, even though they began as minor variations. Modern political boundaries further complicate the picture. Countries as we know them today are recent constructs compared to human evolutionary time. Borders drawn in the last few centuries cut across older patterns of migration and settlement. A single country can contain dozens or even hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, each with its own history and physical variation. Meanwhile, people who share ancestry may live on opposite sides of a modern border. Trying to map appearance onto nation-states creates confusion because the underlying biological story does not follow those lines. Urbanization and modern mobility are now adding yet another layer. Large cities across Asia bring together people from many regions, backgrounds and lineages. Intermarriage is increasingly common, and with it comes even greater diversity of appearance. Children born in these environments often carry features that reflect multiple ancestral paths. Over time, this blending challenges older visual categories and makes simplistic labels even less accurate. Climate adaptation plays a subtle but important role in all of this. Features such as eyelid structure, skin thickness, and fat distribution can be influenced by long-term exposure to cold, wind, sunlight, or humidity. These adaptations are not conscious and not exclusive. They emerge gradually as certain variations offer small advantages in specific conditions. But Asia contains such a wide range of climates that no single adaptive pattern could dominate across the entire continent. What made sense in one region had little relevance in another. Another factor often overlooked is randomness. Not every trait that becomes common does so because it offered a clear advantage. Sometimes a feature spreads simply because it happened to be present in a population that grew rapidly or migrated widely. Genetic drift, especially in small or isolated populations, can amplify certain traits without any strong environmental reason. Over long periods, these chance effects leave visible marks on human diversity. All of this means that when we talk about appearance in Asia, we are really talking about many overlapping stories, not one. Stories shaped by land and weather, by movement and stillness, by connection and separation. Stories written slowly, without design, and constantly revised as circumstances changed. No single description can do justice to that complexity. Recognizing this does more than correct a misunderstanding. It changes how we approach difference itself. When we stop expecting uniformity from a place as vast as Asia, we become better observers. We notice variation instead of flattening it. We ask where traits came from instead of assuming what they mean. We replace shorthand with curiosity, and that shift, small as it seems, opens the door to deeper understanding. The epicanthic fold is often spoken about as if it were a defining feature, something instantly recognizable and neatly contained within a single explanation. In reality, it is neither dramatic nor singular, neither sudden nor simple. It is a small fold of skin, subtle in its physical presence, yet carrying with it a long and complicated history that stretches across development, geography, genetics, and perception. To understand it properly, it helps to slow the pace of explanation and let go of the urge to treat it as a symbol rather than what it actually is, an ordinary anatomical variation that became common in some populations through a mix of circumstance and time. At its most basic, the epicanthic fold is a fold of skin that runs from the upper eyelid across the inner corner of the eye, sometimes partially covering the area where the upper and lower eyelids meet near the nose. It can soften or obscure the inner corner of the eye opening, changing how the eye appears without changing how it functions. Vision is not reduced. Eye movement is not restricted. The fold exists on the surface, part of the skin and soft tissue rather than the eye itself, yet because the eyes are such a focal point of the face, even small changes in this area draw attention. One of the first things that complicates the story is that epicanthic folds are not exclusive to any one group. They are present in many populations to varying degrees. They are especially common in East Asian and Northeast Asian populations, but they also appear in indigenous peoples of the Americas, in some Central Asian groups, and even in certain European populations, particularly in infancy. Many babies are born with epicanthic folds that fade or change as the face grows and the nasal bridge develops. This alone should signal that the feature is not exotic or unusual, but part of normal human variation. Developmentally, the epicanthic fold is tied closely to how the face forms before birth. During early fetal development, the nasal bridge is relatively flat, and the tissues around the eyes are arranged differently than they will be later in life. As the face grows, changes in bone structure, particularly in the nasal region, can alter how the skin around the eyes drapes and folds. In populations where a flatter nasal bridge remains common into adulthood, the epicanthic fold may persist. In populations where the nasal bridge becomes more pronounced, the fold may become less visible or disappear entirely. This means that the epicanthic fold is not a separate structure added onto the face, but a result of how existing tissues relate to one another. Small differences in growth timing, tissue thickness, and bone projection can produce noticeable differences in appearance. These differences are controlled by multiple genes interacting with one another, not by a single genetic switch. That complexity helps explain why the fold varies so much even within families and why it resists simple categorization. Environmental factors likely played a role in shaping how common the epicanthic fold became in certain regions, though it is important to be cautious about overstating this influence. One long-standing hypothesis suggests that the fold offered some protection in cold, windy or snowy environments. By partially covering the inner corner of the eye, it may have helped reduce exposure to dry air, wind and glare from snow or ice. This kind of protection would not need to be dramatic to matter. Even a small reduction in irritation or moisture loss could offer a slight advantage over many generations. However, evolution rarely works through a single cause, and the presence of the epicanthic fold cannot be pinned entirely on climate. Many people live in cold environments without it, and many people with the fold live in warm climates. This points again to the importance of population history and migration. Traits spread because people spread. If a population carrying certain features moves into a new region and grows there, those features may remain common even if the original environmental pressures are no longer present. This is where the story of ancient human movement becomes relevant. As groups moved across northern Asia and into the Americas thousands of years ago, they carried with them the physical traits present in their populations at the time. Over generations, isolation and genetic drift could increase the frequency of some traits, including the epicanthic fold. In this way, a feature that began as a minor variation became a familiar characteristic within certain groups, not because it defined them, but because it happened to travel with them. Another layer of the story involves perception. The epicanthic fold often draws attention because it changes the visible contour of the eye. but perception is influenced by expectation. When people are taught, explicitly or implicitly, that a certain feature is significant, they begin to notice it more. Over time, the feature can become exaggerated in description and misunderstood in meaning. The fold becomes shorthand for identity, rather than one small part of a much larger anatomical picture. This process was amplified by historical attempts to classify humans based on appearance. In earlier centuries, when scientific understanding of genetics and development was limited, observers relied heavily on visible traits to draw conclusions about human differences. These conclusions were often shaped by cultural bias and political agendas rather than evidence. Features like the epicanthic fold were treated as markers of distinct types, reinforcing ideas that are now recognized as deeply flawed. Those old classifications did not just disappear when science advanced. They lingered in language, in imagery, and in social attitudes. As a result, the epicanthic fold became overemphasized, singled out as something unusual or defining, even though it is neither rare nor functionally significant. This historical baggage still influences how the feature is discussed today, sometimes turning a neutral anatomical variation into a point of fixation. Modern medicine and anatomy offer a clearer perspective. From a clinical standpoint, the epicanthic fold is simply one of many variations in eyelid anatomy. Surgeons, pediatricians, and geneticists encounter it routinely. In some cases, a prominent epicanthic fold can be associated with certain medical conditions, but in the vast majority of people, it is entirely benign. Context matters. Without other signs, it is simply part of how that person's face developed. The cultural meaning attached to the fold, however, varies widely. In some societies, it is unremarkable, barely noticed at all. In others, it becomes a focus of aesthetic preference, sometimes even influencing cosmetic practices. These preferences are not universal or fixed. They shift over time, shaped by media, fashion, and social norms. What is considered distinctive or desirable in one era or place may be neutral or unnoticed in another. It is also worth noting how much variation exists within what people casually label as epicanthic folds. Some folds are subtle, visible only at certain angles or expressions. Others are more pronounced. Some taper gradually, while others have a sharper contour. Some change noticeably with age, weight, or facial movement. Treating all of these variations as the same feature erases meaningful nuance and reinforces the illusion of uniformity. From a biological standpoint, the epicanthic fold does not carry information about intelligence, ability, personality, or worth. It is not a signal or a code. It does not imply anything beyond the developmental and historical pathways that produced it. When stripped of cultural assumptions, it becomes what it has always been, a small feature with no inherent message attached. Understanding this helps shift the conversation. Instead of asking why a particular group has a particular feature, a question that often assumes abnormality, we can ask how human variation arises in general. We can explore how migration, isolation, adaptation, and chance interact over long periods. The epicanthic fold then becomes one example among many, no more mysterious than differences in hair texture, skin tone, or facial proportions found across the globe. Long before there were maps with neat borders or names for continents, long before anyone spoke about ancestry or appearance, humans lived at the mercy of their surroundings in a way that is difficult to fully imagine today. Daily life was shaped by wind that cut across open land without obstruction, by sunlight reflecting off snow so bright it could sting the eyes, by cold that crept into bone and muscle and stayed there for months at a time. In these environments, survival depended not on comfort or preference, but on small advantages that accumulated quietly, often unnoticed, over countless generations. Human faces, like the rest of the body, carry subtle records of those ancient conditions, not as deliberate designs, but as outcomes of long-term exposure and adaptation. To understand how environment can shape faces at all, it helps to remember that evolution does not work with blueprints. There is no guiding hand deciding what a face should look like in a cold place versus a warm one. Instead, there is variation, constant and unavoidable. Every generation is born with small differences. Some differences have no effect at all. Some are slightly inconvenient. Others, in certain conditions, may offer a modest benefit. When those conditions persist over long periods, the traits that happen to align better with them tend to remain in the population, simply because the people carrying them are slightly more likely to thrive and pass them on. Cold environments present a very specific set of challenges. Low temperatures increase heat loss. Dry air can irritate skin and mucous membranes. Wind accelerates cooling and increases evaporation. Snow-covered landscapes reflect sunlight intensely, increasing glare and eye strain. In such settings, even small anatomical differences can influence comfort, health, and energy use. Over time, bodies that manage these stresses more efficiently have an edge, not dramatic, but cumulative. Faces are especially exposed. Unlike the torso or limbs, they cannot easily be covered during all activities, especially in ancient contexts where clothing technology was limited. Eyes, nose, lips, and skin were constantly interacting with the environment. It is in this context that certain facial traits became more common in populations living for thousands of years in cold and windy regions. One commonly discussed feature is the epicanthic fold, but it is only one part of a broader pattern. In cold climates, a fold of skin around the eye may have helped reduce exposure to dry air and wind, protecting the delicate tissues at the inner corner of the eye. It may also have helped to limit glare by slightly narrowing the visible eye opening. These effects would not need to be dramatic to matter. Even a small reduction in irritation or tearing could improve daily functioning in harsh conditions. Alongside this, broader facial structure plays a role. Flatter facial profiles with less protruding noses reduce surface area exposed to cold air. In extreme cold, protruding features are more vulnerable to frostbite. Anthropologists have long noted that populations living in colder regions tend to have facial structures that minimize exposure, while populations in warmer regions often have more projecting features that help dissipate heat. This pattern is not absolute, but it appears often enough across different parts of the world to suggest a relationship between climate and facial form. Bright snow introduces another challenge. Snow reflects a high percentage of sunlight, increasing exposure to ultraviolet radiation and glare. Anyone who has spent time in snowy conditions knows how exhausting it can be for the eyes. Ancient humans did not have sunglasses. Anatomical features that reduced light entering the eye even slightly could ease strain. Over generations, such small comforts may have translated into better overall health and function. Wind is another persistent factor. In open landscapes, wind dries out skin and eyes, increasing the risk of irritation and infection. Features that help retain moisture or shield sensitive areas could be beneficial. Again, these advantages would be modest, but evolution works on accumulation, not immediacy. It is important to stress that these adaptations were not conscious responses. No one's body changed because they needed it to. Instead, variation already present in the population interacted with environmental pressures. Some people fared slightly better. Over long stretches of time, that slight difference mattered. However, environment alone never tells the full story. Many people living in cold regions do not share the same facial features, and many people with those features live in warm climates today. This is where migration and history become essential to understanding the pattern. When populations move, they carry their traits with them. If a group adapted to cold conditions later migrated to a warmer region, their features did not automatically disappear. Evolution does not reverse itself quickly, especially if the traits are not harmful in the new environment. This is why similar facial traits can be found in populations now living in very different climates. Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, Central Asia, East Asia, and the Americas all share certain overlapping features, reflecting ancient migration routes and shared ancestry, rather than current conditions. The environment shaped the population at one point in time, and that legacy travelled onward. Cold environments also tend to encourage certain lifestyles that indirectly influence population structure. In harsh climates, survival often depends on cooperation, mobility, and efficient use of resources. Populations may remain relatively small and isolated for long periods. Isolation reduces genetic mixing with outside groups, allowing certain traits to become more common simply through repetition. This is not because the traits are better in some abstract sense, but because there are fewer alternatives entering the gene pool. Isolation also amplifies genetic drift, the process by which random traits become more or less common by chance. In small populations, a feature can spread simply because the people carrying it happen to have more descendants. Over centuries, this randomness leaves visible marks on appearance. Environment sets the stage, but chance often writes the details. Another factor to consider is childhood development. The environment experienced during early life can influence how certain features express themselves. Cold, dry air affects skin and soft tissues differently than warm, humid air. Nutrition, which is closely tied to environment, influences bone growth and facial proportions. Diets based on hunting and preserved foods differ from those based on agriculture, and these differences can subtly affect jaw structure, tooth size, and facial shape over generations. Even posture and habitual facial expressions can play a role. In cold environments, people may squint more often, tense facial muscles differently, or protect their faces instinctively. While these behaviours do not directly change genetics, they interact with existing anatomy and can influence how features are perceived and emphasised over time. What often gets lost in discussions of climate and appearance is the sheer timescale involved. These changes did not happen quickly. They unfolded over tens of thousands of years, across periods when human life expectancy was short and daily survival was uncertain. The faces we see today are not products of recent conditions, but echoes of ancient worlds that no longer exist in the same form. It is also crucial to avoid turning these explanations into rigid rules. Not every cold environment produces the same adaptations. Not every population responds in the same way. Human evolution is messy, influenced by overlapping pressures rather than single causes. Climate is one factor among many, interacting with migration, culture, technology, and chance. Technology itself eventually altered the relationship between environment and anatomy. The development of better clothing, shelter, and fire reduced direct exposure to the elements. As humans gained more control over their surroundings, the selective pressure exerted by climate weakened. This means that many traits shaped by ancient environments persist today, even though the original conditions are no longer as relevant. Modern life often obscures this history. Heated buildings, artificial lighting, and climate control create environments that are far removed from those that shaped our ancestors. Yet our bodies still reflect those older realities. Facial features developed in response to cold winds and bright snow remain part of human diversity, even in places where those conditions are rare or absent. Understanding this helps reframe how we think about difference. Features are not arbitrary. They are not signals of belonging or exclusion. They are records of survival in specific contexts, written slowly into the human form. When we recognize this, the focus shifts away from categorization and toward continuity. Every face becomes evidence of adaptation, resilience, and movement through time. Long before a human being opens their eyes to the world, long before light ever reaches the retina or vision becomes a conscious experience, the foundations of what those eyes will look like are already being quietly laid down. This process begins early, unfolds gradually, and depends on a delicate choreography of growth, timing, and interaction between tissues that are all responding to the same genetic instructions, yet never in exactly the same way twice. When we talk about variation in eye appearance, including eyelids, folds, spacing, and contour, we are really talking about variation that begins before birth, at a stage when there is no environment in the everyday sense, no culture, no social meaning attached to faces at all. There is only development. In the earliest weeks of pregnancy, the structures that will eventually become the face begin as a flat field of tissue. There is no nose, no eyes, no mouth, just a developing neural tube and surrounding cells that are rapidly dividing and migrating. The eyes start forming as small outpouchings of the developing brain, known as optic vesicles. This alone surprises many people. The eyes are not simply added onto the face later. They are extensions of the brain itself, growing outward and then becoming surrounded by other facial structures as development continues. As these optic vesicles grow, they induce the formation of surrounding tissues. The lens, the retina, and other internal components of the eye begin to differentiate. At the same time, the surface tissues that will become the eyelids start to take shape. Early on, the eyelids actually fuse together, sealing the developing eye completely. This fusion is temporary, a protective measure during a critical period of development. The eyelids will later separate, but the timing and manner of that separation can influence how the eyelids look after birth. Around this developing eye, several types of tissue are interacting at once. Bone is forming beneath the surface, shaping the eye socket. Muscles are organizing themselves to allow for movement. Fat pads are being positioned, particularly in the upper eyelid and brow area. Skin is growing and folding over these deeper structures. Each of these processes is guided by genetic signals, but those signals do not operate in isolation. They respond to one another, and small differences in timing can produce visible differences in outcome. This is one of the most important points when it comes to understanding variation. Development is not a rigid assembly line. It is a dynamic process. If one tissue grows slightly faster or slower than another, the final arrangement can change. A tiny difference early on can cascade into a noticeable difference later. This is not an error. It is how biological systems work. When people talk about eye shape differences, they are often focusing on the eyelids, especially the upper eyelid. Whether a visible crease forms depends on how the muscle that lifts the eyelid attaches to the skin. In some individuals, this attachment occurs higher up, creating a visible fold when the eye is open. In others, the attachment is lower or distributed differently, resulting in a smooth lid without a pronounced crease. Both outcomes are entirely normal. Neither affects vision. Neither implies anything about function or health. The presence or absence of an epicanthic fold is also established during this developmental period. As the face grows, the nasal bridge begins to project forward. The degree and timing of this projection influence how the skin around the inner corner of the eye settles. In faces where the nasal bridge remains relatively flat, the skin may form a fold that covers part of the inner eye corner. In faces where the bridge becomes more prominent, that fold may be stretched or reduced. Again, these are outcomes of growth patterns, not add-ons or special features inserted later. It is important to emphasize that all of these structures begin from a very similar starting point. Human embryos are remarkably alike in early development. The divergence that leads to visible variation occurs gradually, through many small steps. Genes provide instructions, but they do not dictate exact measurements in the way a blueprint dictates dimensions. They set ranges, probabilities, and responses. The final result emerges from interaction, not command. This is why even people who share a great deal of genetic material, such as siblings or even identical twins, can have noticeable differences in eye appearance. Identical twins share nearly all of their DNA, but they do not share the same developmental environment in every detail. Differences in blood flow, positioning in the womb, or timing of tissue growth can lead to subtle variations. These differences remind us that genetics sets the stage, but development writes the script as it goes. Another source of variation comes from the fact that many genes influence facial development, and they do so in overlapping ways. There is no single gene for eye shape, eyelid fold, or facial contour. Instead, dozens or even hundreds of genes contribute to how tissues grow, migrate, and interact. Some genes influence bone growth, others affect skin elasticity, others regulate muscle formation or fat distribution. The combined effect of these genes produces a wide range of possible outcomes, even within the same population. Because these genes interact, variation does not fall into neat categories. It exists on a continuum. This is why trying to draw sharp lines between different types of eyes or faces never works well. There is always overlap. There are always exceptions. Nature does not respect the boundaries humans prefer for convenience. Timing plays a particularly important role. Development happens in phases, and the sequence of events matters. If one structure develops slightly earlier or later than usual, it can influence how other structures align with it. For example, the timing of eyelid separation relative to the growth of surrounding tissues can affect how folds form. These timing differences are influenced by genetics, but also by conditions in the womb, such as hormone levels and nutrient availability. Nutrition during pregnancy can influence facial development indirectly by affecting overall growth rates. Severe nutritional deficiencies can alter bone and tissue development, but even within normal ranges, small differences can contribute to variation. Again, this does not produce dramatic or predictable changes. It adds another layer of subtlety to the process. It is also worth noting that many features associated with eye appearance continue to change after birth. The face grows rapidly during infancy and childhood. The nasal bridge often becomes more prominent with age. Fat distribution shifts. Skin tightens or loosens. As a result, eye appearance can change over time, sometimes significantly. Features that are prominent in infancy may soften or disappear, while others become more noticeable. This developmental perspective helps explain why it is misleading to treat eye features as fixed markers of identity. They are not static traits stamped onto a person at birth. They are outcomes of a long process that begins early, continues through childhood, and reflects both inherited tendencies and developmental pathways. Understanding where variation begins also helps dismantle the idea that certain features need special explanations. When variation is recognized as an inherent property of development, the question shifts from, why do these people look different, to, how does human development produce such a range of outcomes? The latter question is far more interesting and far less loaded. There is a tendency in popular discussions to search for single causes, single reasons that can explain visible differences. But development does not offer single causes. It offers networks of influence. Trying to isolate one factor oversimplifies a process that is inherently complex. Another important point is that variation does not arise because something went wrong. Differences in eye appearance are not errors or deviations from a norm. They are expressions of a flexible system designed to produce a range of viable forms. From an evolutionary perspective, this flexibility is an advantage. It allows populations to adapt over time to changing conditions. The face, including the eyes, is particularly sensitive to this flexibility because it involves many interacting tissues and because it plays a role in communication and social interaction. Small changes can have noticeable effects without compromising function. This makes facial features especially variable across populations. By the time a person is born, the basic framework of their eye appearance is already in place, shaped by months of development that unfolded without awareness or intention. The environment outside the womb will later add its own influences through expression, aging, and context, but the foundational variation begins much earlier. Imagine for a moment a small group of people standing at the edge of a familiar landscape, not because they intend to leave everything behind, but because staying has quietly become harder than moving on. Resources have shifted. The climate has changed slightly. Animals migrate along new paths. Children are born, elders age, and the balance that once worked no longer quite does. So the group moves, not all at once, not with certainty, but step by step into terrain that looks almost the same, until eventually it doesn't. This moment repeated thousands of times across tens of thousands of years, is where the slow story of population drift begins. Human migration is rarely a dramatic march across continents. More often it is incremental. One valley farther, one river crossed, one generation settling a little farther from the last. Over long stretches of time, these small movements accumulate into vast distances, and as people move, they do not just carry tools, stories and languages. They carry their genes. They carry the developmental tendencies that shape faces, bodies, and yes, eyes. Once a group becomes separated from others, even slightly, the conditions are set for gradual divergence. Isolation does not require complete separation. It only requires reduced mixing. If two populations exchange fewer members over generations, their gene pools begin to drift apart. This process is slow, quiet, and largely invisible in the short term. No one notices it happening. But over hundreds or thousands of years, small differences in gene frequencies become noticeable differences in appearance. Not because the populations are becoming something new, but because they are continuing along different paths with slightly different starting points. One of the most important mechanisms at work here is the founder effect. When a small group breaks off from a larger population, it carries with it only a subset of the original genetic variation. If certain traits happen to be more common in that small group, those traits may become more common in the new population, regardless of whether they offer any particular advantage. Over time, this can give the impression that a feature is characteristic of a group, when in fact it was simply present in the founders by chance. Genetic drift reinforces this effect. In small populations, random fluctuations in who has children and how many can significantly alter the frequency of traits. A feature does not need to be beneficial to spread. It only needs to be carried by people who happen to leave more descendants. In large populations, these random effects tend to average out. In small or isolated ones, they can reshape appearance over surprisingly short evolutionary timescales. Asia's geography made both migration and isolation especially influential. Vast mountain ranges such as the Himalayas created formidable barriers that limited movement for long periods. Deserts like the Gobi and the Arabian Desert restricted travel routes, funneling migration along certain paths while isolating others. Dense forests, frozen tundra, and open steppe each shaped how easily people could move, settle, and interact. The result was a patchwork of populations, some frequently mixing, others remaining relatively distinct for thousands of years. Consider populations moving across northern Asia during colder periods. As ice sheets expanded and sea levels dropped, land bridges appeared, connecting regions that are now separated by water. One of the most significant was Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Asia and North America. Groups that crossed into the Americas became isolated from their Asian relatives as sea levels rose again. Over time, this isolation allowed certain traits, including facial features like epicanthic folds, to remain common in both regions, reflecting shared ancestry rather than ongoing contact. Within Asia itself, similar patterns played out repeatedly. Groups moved into river valleys and settled, while others remained nomadic on the steppe. Some populations became tied to coastal environments, while others adapted to high-altitude plateaus. Each lifestyle influenced who interacted with whom. Trade routes connected some regions while bypassing others. Marriage patterns followed cultural and geographic lines, further shaping gene flow. It is tempting to imagine migration as a one-time event, but in reality it is often cyclical. Populations expand, contract, split, and merge. Periods of connection are followed by periods of isolation. Climate shifts can reopen or close routes that were once impassable. Over time, this creates layers of ancestry rather than clean divisions. A population may carry genetic traces of several migrations, each contributing slightly to the overall picture. Isolation does not mean stagnation. Even when groups are relatively cut off, internal variation continues. New mutations arise naturally in every generation. Most have no visible effect. Some subtly influence development. Over long periods, these mutations add to the diversity within the group. When combined with genetic drift, they can produce distinctive patterns without any external influence. This helps explain why populations that appear geographically close can look different, while populations separated by great distances can share similarities. It is not distance alone that matters, but the history of contact. Two regions separated by a mountain range may exchange fewer people than two regions separated by a long but navigable coastline. Over time, those differences in contact leave visible marks. Eye-related features, like other facial traits, are particularly sensitive to these processes because they are influenced by many genes and because small differences are easily noticed. A slight shift in eyelid structure, crease formation, or fold prominence can become a recognizable pattern within a population if it happens to be present in the founders or amplified by drift. There is no need to invoke strong selection or adaptation in every case. Chance plays a larger role than we often like to admit. Another factor is cultural preference, which can indirectly influence genetic patterns. If certain traits are viewed as attractive or familiar within a group, people carrying those traits may be slightly more likely to form partnerships. Over many generations, this can nudge trait frequencies without any conscious intent. This is not about design or planning. It is about patterns that emerge when biology and social behavior interact over long periods. The slow pace of these changes is easy to underestimate. A few generations show almost no visible difference. A few dozen generations might show subtle shifts. But stretch that process over hundreds or thousands of generations, and the accumulation becomes unmistakable. This is why human diversity looks the way it does today, rich in variation yet connected by shared origins. Importantly, drift does not move populations toward any ideal or endpoint. It has no direction. It does not produce progress or decline. It simply produces difference. Traits that become common in one population could just as easily have become rare if circumstances were slightly different. This randomness is a fundamental feature of evolution, even though it can feel uncomfortable to accept. Understanding migration and isolation also helps dismantle the idea that visible traits define rigid groups. Populations are not static entities. They are fluid, shaped by movement and interaction. Boundaries shift, lineages intertwine. What we see at any given moment is a snapshot, not a permanent state. Modern genetics has made this clearer than ever. Studies consistently show that most human genetic variation exists within populations rather than between them. The differences we notice, including those in eye appearance, represent a small fraction of our overall similarity. Yet because faces are so salient, those small differences loom large in perception. As transportation and communication have accelerated in recent centuries, many of the isolating factors that once shaped populations have weakened. People move farther and more frequently. Gene flow increases. Old patterns blur. This does not erase history, but it does add new layers. The faces of future generations will reflect both ancient migrations and modern mobility. Holding this long view changes how we interpret appearance. Instead of seeing features as markers of fixed identity, we can see them as outcomes of journeys, pauses, separations, and reunions. Every face carries traces of movement, whether recent or ancient. The epicanthic fold, eyelid structure, and other eye features are part of this broader story, shaped not by any single force, but by the interplay of migration and isolation over deep time. At first glance, it can feel puzzling, even counterintuitive, to notice similar eye features appearing in people whose family histories, languages, and locations seem to have nothing in common. You might see a familiar eyelid fold or eye contour in populations separated by oceans or thousands of kilometers of land, and the instinctive question arises almost immediately. How can that be if these groups are not closely related? The answer does not lie in hidden connections or forgotten migrations in every case. Instead, it lies in the way human biology works when it's constrained by shared anatomy, shared physics, and shared developmental pathways. To understand this, it helps to step away from ancestry for a moment and think about form. The human face, for all its variation, is built from the same basic components everywhere. 2 eyes, a nose between them, muscles that lift and close the eyelids, bones that form sockets, skin that must stretch and fold over those structures. There are only so many ways to arrange these elements while still producing a face that functions properly. When variation occurs within these constraints, certain outcomes become more likely than others, even in populations that have never met. This phenomenon is known in biology as convergent evolution. It describes situations where similar traits arise independently in different populations because those traits represent workable solutions to similar challenges. The classic examples involve animals. Wings evolved separately in birds, bats, and insects. Eyes evolved multiple times in different branches of life. These similarities do not imply close relationship. They reflect the fact that certain structures are simply effective under certain conditions. In humans, convergent patterns are more subtle, but they still exist. Eye shape, particularly features involving eyelids and surrounding tissues, is influenced by how skin, muscle, and bone interact during development. Because these interactions follow similar rules in all humans, certain variations recur. If a developmental pathway is especially stable or efficient, it may appear again and again, even in populations with no recent shared ancestry. One important factor is that the genes involved in facial development are widely shared across humanity. While their frequencies differ between populations, the genes themselves are not unique to any one group. This means that similar combinations can arise independently. When those combinations produce a visible feature, such as a particular eyelid contour or fold, the result can look strikingly familiar across different regions. Environmental pressures can further encourage convergence. As discussed earlier, cold, wind, and glare present challenges that affect the eyes in similar ways wherever they occur. Populations living in cold regions of Europe, Asia, and the Americas have faced overlapping conditions, even if their histories diverged long before those environments were encountered. In such cases, similar anatomical responses may emerge, not because the populations are closely related, but because they are responding to similar constraints with the same biological toolkit. However, it is crucial not to overstate this point. Not every shared feature is adaptive, and not every convergence is driven by environment. Development itself has preferred pathways. Some arrangements of tissue are simply more likely to occur because they are stable outcomes of growth. When development is influenced by many interacting genes, certain results appear more often than others, purely because they sit at a kind of developmental crossroads. This is sometimes referred to as developmental constraint. It means that variation is not infinite. Faces cannot take on any conceivable form. They vary within limits imposed by how tissues grow and interact. Within those limits, certain eye shapes are easier to produce than others. When different populations explore that same space of possibilities, overlap is inevitable. Another contributor to apparent similarity is perception. Human brains are exceptionally sensitive to faces, but they also simplify what they see. When we notice a feature that stands out to us, we may group together faces that actually differ in many ways. Two people might both have an epicanthic fold, for example, but differ in eye spacing, lid thickness, crease position, and surrounding bone structure. Our perception latches onto the shared element and downplays the differences, creating an impression of similarity that is stronger than the reality. This perceptual shortcut is reinforced by language. When we label a feature with a single term, we collapse variation into a category. Over time, that category becomes a mental template. Any face that fits the template loosely enough gets grouped in, even if the underlying anatomy differs significantly. This is one reason why similar eye shapes seem to appear across unrelated groups. The similarity is real, but it is often partial rather than complete. History adds another layer. Some populations that appear unrelated today may share ancient ancestry that is not obvious from modern cultural boundaries. Human migration did not follow the lines we draw on maps now. Groups split, moved, and mixed in ways that are difficult to reconstruct fully. A feature that arose in a population tens of thousands of years ago could persist in multiple descendant groups that later became culturally distinct. In such cases, similarity reflects deep history rather than recent connection. At the same time, we must resist the temptation to explain every similarity this way. Genetics shows that many populations that share certain facial features are not especially close in terms of overall ancestry. This tells us that independent emergence is common and expected. The human genome is large, but the number of ways it can produce a functioning face is smaller than we might intuitively think. Another aspect worth considering is how small the differences often are. When people say two eye shapes look similar, they're usually responding to a handful of features, not the entire facial structure. A similar fold or contour can stand out even when everything else differs. Because the eyes are such a focal point, those similarities carry disproportionate weight in perception. There is also a cultural feedback loop. Once a similarity is noticed and named, it becomes easier to notice again. Media representation can amplify this effect by repeatedly presenting certain features as typical of a group. Over time, viewers come to expect those features, which further reinforces the impression that they are widespread or defining, even when they are not. From a biological standpoint, none of this is surprising. Humans are a young species. We share the vast majority of our genetic material. Variation exists, but it unfolds within a narrow range compared to many other species. Given this, it would be far more surprising if similar features did not appear in unrelated groups from time to time. What is often missing from casual discussions is an appreciation of scale. The differences between populations are small compared to the similarities, yet because our brains are tuned to faces, we magnify those small differences and similarities alike. This magnification can make patterns feel more significant than they are biologically. Another misconception worth addressing is the idea that similar features must serve the same function wherever they appear. Even if a trait originally arose under certain environmental conditions, it does not necessarily retain that function everywhere. A feature that once offered some advantage may persist long after that advantage becomes irrelevant, simply because it does not interfere with survival or reproduction. In such cases, similarity reflects historical inertia rather than ongoing adaptation. Modern life further complicates the picture. Increased mobility and intermarriage blur old patterns and create new combinations. A feature that once appeared in isolated populations may now show up in entirely new contexts. This does not invalidate the history behind it, but it does make simple explanations less useful. Understanding why similar eye shapes appear across unrelated groups ultimately requires holding several ideas at once. Shared developmental pathways, environmental constraints, genetic drift, perceptual simplification, historical movement. None of these alone is sufficient. Together they create a picture in which similarity is not mysterious, but expected. This perspective also helps shift the conversation away from categorization and toward process. Instead of asking which groups have which features, we can ask how features arise, spread, and persist. That shift removes the implicit ranking that often creeps into discussions of appearance and replaces it with curiosity about how human variation actually works. Genetics often enters conversations about human appearance with an air of authority, as if once the word is spoken, every question should settle neatly into place. It sounds precise, scientific, definitive. People imagine genes as tiny instructions that dictate exactly how someone will look, where they come from, and how they relate to others. But when it comes to features like eye shape, and especially when those features are discussed in broad population-level terms, genetics tells a story that is far more careful, far more limited, and far less satisfying to anyone hoping for simple answers. To begin with, It is worth clarifying what genetics actually studies in this context. Human genetics looks at patterns of variation in DNA, the long sequences of chemical letters that carry information from one generation to the next. These sequences influence how proteins are built, how cells behave, and how tissues develop. But DNA does not operate like a set of labelled switches, one for eye shape, one for skin tone, one for height. Instead, most visible traits arise from the interaction of many genes, each contributing a small effect, and each influenced by timing, environment, and chance. When people ask what genetics says about eye shape, they're often imagining that scientists can point to a specific gene and say, "This is the reason." That is not how it works. Eye appearance is a polygenic trait, meaning it is influenced by many genes acting together. Some of these genes affect bone growth in the face, others influence muscle attachment, skin thickness, fat distribution, or connective tissue. Still others regulate how these tissues respond to growth signals during development. None of them acts alone, and none of them carries a clear label that says what a finished eye should look like. Because of this, genetics does not divide humanity into neat visual categories. When geneticists study populations, they do not find sharp boundaries where one set of genes ends and another begins. Instead, they see gradual shifts in gene frequencies across geography. Traits change slowly from place to place, overlapping extensively. Two neighbouring populations may differ slightly in the frequency of certain variants, but individuals from those populations often share more genetic similarity with each other than with people from far away, regardless of appearance. One of the most consistent findings in human genetics is that most variation exists within populations, not between them. This means that two people from the same population can be more genetically different from each other than either is from someone in a different population. Visible traits like eye shape represent only a tiny fraction of our genetic differences, yet they receive outsized attention because they are easy to see and easy to talk about. Genetics also tells us that traits associated with appearance are rarely exclusive. The same genetic variants that influence eyelid structure or facial contour can be found across many populations, just at different frequencies. There is no gene that belongs to one continent or one group. What differs is how common certain combinations become due to history, migration, drift, and selection. This is a crucial distinction that often gets lost in public discussions. Another point genetics makes very clear is that visible similarity does not equal close genetic relationship. Two people may share similar eye features but be genetically quite distant overall. Conversely, two people who look very different may be genetically quite close. Appearance is shaped by a small subset of our genome, and that subset does not track perfectly with overall ancestry. This is one reason why relying on looks to infer genetic background is unreliable. Genetic studies that focus on ancestry often use markers spread across the genome to estimate relatedness. These markers are chosen because they vary between populations in ways that reflect historical separation and mixing. They are not chosen because they influence appearance. As a result, ancestry estimates can sometimes surprise people who expect their looks to align neatly with genetic results. Genetics does not promise to confirm visual expectations, and it frequently does not. It is also important to address what genetics definitely does not say. Genetics does not support the idea that physical traits define discrete biological races. While populations differ in the frequency of certain genetic variants, these differences do not cluster into a small number of clearly separated groups. The concept of race, as it has been used historically, does not align with the continuous, overlapping patterns revealed by genetic data. This matters because features like eye shape have often been treated as racial markers, used to categorize and rank people. Genetics undermines this approach. It shows that such features are poor proxies for overall genetic similarity and tell us very little about a person beyond a narrow aspect of development. Using them to draw broader conclusions is not supported by evidence. Another misconception genetics corrects is the idea that traits must have a purpose. People often assume that if a feature is common in a population, it must have been strongly selected for, that it must confer some advantage. While this can be true in some cases, genetics shows that many traits persist simply because they are neutral. They do not help or harm enough to be removed. They drift along as populations grow and change. In the case of eye features, some may have offered minor advantages in certain environments at certain times, but many simply reflect the way development unfolds given a particular genetic background. Genetics does not insist on adaptive explanations for every visible difference. Sometimes the explanation is simply that nothing pushed the trait out of the population. Genetics also highlights the role of recombination. Each generation, genetic material from parents is shuffled in new ways. This creates new combinations of traits that did not exist before. Over time, recombination ensures that features do not remain locked together. A person may inherit eyelid traits from one ancestor, nose shape from another, and skin tone from yet another. This mixing further weakens any attempt to tie a specific look to a specific lineage. Modern genetic research has also revealed how recent much of human divergence is. Compared to many species, humans are genetically very similar to one another. Our species experienced population bottlenecks in the past, periods when numbers were low, reducing genetic diversity. Much of the variation we see today has arisen since humans spread across the globe relatively recently in evolutionary terms. This recency explains why differences exist but are shallow. Another area where genetics offers clarity is in debunking hierarchical interpretations of traits. Genes do not encode superiority or inferiority, they encode variation. When certain traits become associated with value judgments, those judgments come from culture, not biology. Genetics does not rank features. It does not assign meaning beyond function and development. It is also worth addressing the limits of what genetics can currently explain. While researchers can identify regions of the genome associated with certain aspects of facial structure, predicting a face from DNA alone remains extremely difficult. This is not just a technical limitation, it reflects the inherent complexity of development. Genes influence probabilities, not certainties. The same genetic makeup can produce slightly different outcomes depending on context. This uncertainty frustrates people looking for definitive answers, but it is an honest reflection of how biology works. Genetics is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It does not reduce humans to codes that can be read off like instructions. It describes tendencies and patterns, not destinies. Another important clarification is that genetic similarity does not equate to cultural similarity. Populations can be genetically close and culturally distinct, or culturally similar and genetically mixed. Appearance sits at an awkward intersection of these domains, often mistaken as a stand-in for both. Genetics helps disentangle this by showing that shared features do not imply shared culture, history, or experience. As genetic testing has become more accessible, public interest has grown, but so has misunderstanding. Commercial ancestry tests often present results in simplified categories, which can reinforce the idea that genetics divides people into clear groups. In reality, these categories are statistical constructs based on reference populations. They are tools, not truths. They describe probabilities, not identities. Genetics also reminds us that variation continues. There is no finished version of the human face. As populations continue to mix and environments continue to change, new combinations will emerge. Features that were once common may become less so. Others may spread. This ongoing process resists any attempt to freeze human diversity into fixed images. When it comes to eye shape, genetics ultimately tells a modest story. It tells us that variation arises from many small influences. It tells us that similar features can appear in many places without implying close connection. It tells us that differences are real, but limited, noticeable but shallow. and it tells us that using those differences to define groups or draw conclusions goes beyond what the evidence supports. What genetics definitely does not say is that appearance determines identity, ability, or belonging. It does not say that one look is more natural or more authentic than another. It does not carve humanity into boxes that align with how we have historically talked about race or difference. Those ideas come from social history, not from DNA. Holding on to what genetics actually shows and letting go of what it does not creates space for a calmer, more accurate understanding of human variation. It allows us to see features like eye shape as part of a broad, shared biological story rather than as markers of separation. It's easy, almost automatic, to slip into thinking about evolution as if it were a ladder. One rung higher, one rung lower, more advanced, less advanced, better adapted, worse adapted. This way of thinking feels intuitive because it mirrors how we talk about progress in technology or skill, where newer often replaces older and improvement has a clear direction. But biological evolution does not work like that at all, and when we apply ladder thinking to human appearance, especially to visible traits like eye shape, we end up with conclusions that biology simply does not support. Evolution has no finish line. There is no ideal form toward which all life is striving. There is no ranking system embedded in DNA. What evolution produces is variation that happens to work well enough in a particular context at a particular time. When contexts change, what works well enough can change too. A trait that is common in one population is not better than a different trait common in another population. It is simply the result of a different history interacting with different conditions. This distinction matters because so much of the confusion around human differences comes from the mistaken belief that variation implies evaluation. When people notice that a feature differs between populations, the unspoken assumption often follows that one version must be superior, more advanced, more refined, or more normal. Evolutionary biology rejects that assumption entirely. Difference is not a value judgment. It is a description. To see why hierarchy does not belong in evolution, it helps to look at how traits persist. A trait remains common in a population if it does not significantly reduce the chances of survival and reproduction in that environment. That's it. There is no requirement that it be optimal, beautiful, efficient, or impressive. It just needs to not be a problem. Many traits are effectively neutral. They neither help nor hinder in any meaningful way, and so they persist simply because nothing removes them. Eye shape is a good example of this. Variations in eyelid structure, folds, and contours do not meaningfully affect vision in the vast majority of cases. They do not make someone see better or worse. They do not confer intelligence or skill. They do not predict behavior. As a result, these traits are free to drift, shaped by history, migration, and development rather than strict selection. Their presence tells us nothing about quality or ranking. The idea of hierarchy in evolution is a cultural overlay, not a biological principle. It has roots in historical attempts to classify humans during periods when scientific understanding was limited, and social inequality was often justified by pseudoscience. Physical traits were sorted, ranked, and used to support existing power structures. Those classifications lingered in language and habit long after they were discredited, quietly shaping how difference is perceived. Modern evolutionary theory dismantles this framework. It shows that all humans share a recent common ancestry. It shows that the genetic differences between populations are small and gradual. It shows that traits associated with appearance are a tiny part of our overall biology. Most importantly, it shows that there is no evolutionary scale on which one population can be placed above another. Another way to understand this is to think in terms of trade-offs rather than improvements. Every trait comes with constraints. A feature that is beneficial in one context may be irrelevant, or even mildly disadvantageous in another. Thick body hair might be useful in cold climates, and uncomfortable in hot ones. A nose shape that warms cold air efficiently might retain heat less effectively in warm, humid conditions. None of these traits is better in an absolute sense. They are better or worse only relative to a specific set of circumstances, and even then the differences are often minor. When environments change, those trade-offs shift. But traits do not instantly disappear or appear. Human populations carry layers of history in their bodies. Features shaped by ancient environments persist long after those environments are gone, simply because they do not interfere with life in new conditions. This persistence is not stagnation, it is continuity. Hierarchy also collapses when we consider that evolution operates on populations, not individuals. A trait being common in a population does not mean every individual has it, and it does not define that population as a whole. Variation exists within every group. Any attempt to rank groups based on a few visible traits ignores the immense overlap between them. It is also worth noting that what people often perceive as different is heavily influenced by familiarity. Features that are common in one's own community fade into the background. Features that are less familiar stand out. This perceptual bias can make difference feel larger and more meaningful than it actually is. Over time, repeated emphasis on certain features can turn them into symbols, even though biologically they are mundane. Evolutionary biology encourages a different perspective. Instead of asking which traits are better, it asks which traits are present, how they arose, and why they were not removed. This shift removes judgment and replaces it with curiosity. It also aligns better with the evidence. There is no signal in the genome that assigns higher status to one set of features over another. Another important point is that human evolution did not stop in the past. It is ongoing. Populations continue to change, mix, and adapt. Traits that are common today may become less common in the future, not because they are worse, but because patterns of movement and reproduction change. In a world of increasing global mobility, many old visual patterns are already blending. This does not represent loss or improvement. It represents change. The absence of hierarchy also means there is no default human appearance. There is no original or standard face from which others deviate. Every population represents one outcome among many possible outcomes. When people unconsciously treat certain features as default and others as deviations, they are projecting cultural norms onto biology. Evolution does not recognize defaults. It recognizes only variation. This becomes especially clear when looking beyond humans. In nature, diversity is the rule, not the exception. No one would argue that one bird species is more evolved than another simply because their feathers differ. No one would claim that one tree species is better than another because its leaves have a different shape. These ideas feel absurd when applied to other organisms, yet they creep into discussions of humans because of social history, not biological reality. Understanding evolution without hierarchy also helps dismantle the notion that difference needs explanation, while sameness does not. Often, people ask why a particular group looks a certain way, implicitly treating that appearance as unusual. Meanwhile, the appearance of their own group goes unquestioned, as if it were the baseline. Evolutionary thinking reveals that all appearances require explanation, or more accurately, none do in isolation. They're all outcomes of the same processes. Another misconception tied to hierarchy is the idea that evolution produces refinement over time, as if newer traits replace older, cruder ones. In reality, many traits persist for extremely long periods because they work well enough. Humans still have wisdom teeth. We still have vestigial muscles. We still blink reflexively. These features are not optimized away because they do not impose enough cost to be removed. Facial features fall into the same category. They remain because there is no strong reason for them to disappear. The language we use matters here. Words like primitive and advanced carry heavy implications, yet they have no place in modern evolutionary biology. A trait is not primitive because it is old, nor advanced because it is recent. Age does not confer value. function and context matter, and even then, only narrowly. When hierarchy is removed, something interesting happens. Difference becomes less threatening. If variation does not imply ranking, then noticing difference does not require justification or defense. It simply becomes part of the landscape of human diversity. This shift allows for more accurate, calmer conversations about appearance, grounded in biology rather than inherited assumptions. It also opens space to appreciate the sheer adaptability of the human species. The fact that humans can thrive in such a wide range of environments with relatively minor physical differences is remarkable. Eye shape variation is one small expression of that adaptability. It reflects how flexible development can be, how many viable forms the human face can take without compromising function. Another layer worth considering is that cultural values often invert biological neutrality. Features that are biologically neutral can become socially charged. They can be praised, stigmatized, or commodified. None of this reflects their evolutionary significance. It reflects social dynamics. Separating these domains helps prevent biology from being misused to justify social judgments. Evolution without hierarchy also aligns with what genetics shows about relatedness. There is no population that stands apart as more evolved. All humans alive today are equally distant from our common ancestors. Every lineage has been evolving for the same amount of time. This simple fact alone dismantles the idea that some groups are ahead or behind on an evolutionary path. When applied to eye shape, this understanding clarifies a great deal. Differences in eyelids, folds, and contours are not steps toward or away from anything. They're endpoints in themselves, shaped by development and history, stable because they work, and free to vary because they do not constrain survival. Treating them as indicators of anything beyond that misrepresents both evolution and humanity. By the time modern science began to develop tools capable of actually studying human variation with care and precision, the conversation about physical difference had already been bent badly out of shape. Ideas about who looked like whom, who belonged where, and what those differences supposedly meant were not born in laboratories or universities. They were forged earlier, in periods of exploration, conquest and empire, when power moved faster than understanding, and when explanations were often designed to justify actions rather than to describe reality. Once those ideas took hold, they proved remarkably difficult to uproot, even after the evidence beneath them collapsed. For much of recorded history, people understood difference locally. Communities knew who lived nearby and who came from farther away. Variation existed, but it was not organized into global systems of classification. A traveller looked different because they were from somewhere else, not because they belonged to a fixed category defined by appearance alone. That changed dramatically between the 15th and 19th centuries as European powers expanded outward through trade, colonization and conquest, encountering an unprecedented range of human diversity in a relatively short span of time. Faced with this sudden exposure to unfamiliar faces, languages and customs, European thinkers began trying to organize humanity into simplified frameworks. These frameworks were not neutral. They were shaped by existing beliefs about hierarchy, religion and power. Physical traits became convenient markers for drawing lines, and those lines were quickly turned into ladders. Skin color, skull shape, facial features, including eye shape, were catalogued, measured, and ranked, often with little rigor and even less humility. One of the earliest and most damaging moves was the attempt to treat visible traits as indicators of deeper qualities. Facial features were not just described, they were interpreted. Certain appearances were associated with intelligence, morality, or capability, while others were framed as evidence of inferiority or primitiveness. These interpretations were not derived from data. They were imposed to support political and economic systems that depended on inequality. Colonialism created a powerful incentive to naturalize hierarchy. If domination could be framed as the inevitable result of biological difference, then it could be presented as order rather than violence. Pseudoscientific theories flourished in this environment because they offered simple explanations for complex realities and moral cover for exploitation. Measurements were taken, charts were drawn, and conclusions were declared long before the methods could support them. Eye shape became one of many features swept into this process. Rather than being understood as a neutral variation shaped by development and history, it was treated as a marker of type. Entire populations were reduced to caricatures, their diversity erased in favour of a single exaggerated image. This flattening made it easier to speak about groups as monolithic and to assign them fixed positions in a global hierarchy. Craniometry, the practice of measuring skulls to infer intelligence or character, is one of the most notorious examples of this era's pseudoscience. Researchers claimed that skull size or shape correlated with mental ability, ignoring overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Facial features, including the eye region, were folded into these analyses, reinforcing the idea that appearance revealed destiny. Today, these practices are recognized as deeply flawed, both methodologically and ethically, but at the time they were treated as serious science. What made these ideas particularly persistent was their alignment with existing power structures. Institutions funded research that confirmed their worldview. Educational systems taught simplified classifications. Museums displayed human remains and casts as evidence of supposed evolutionary ranking. Over time, these narratives became embedded in culture, passed down not just through textbooks but through art, literature, and everyday language. Even when science began to challenge these ideas, the damage had already been done. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, evolutionary theory itself was sometimes misused to reinforce hierarchy, despite Charles Darwin's own emphasis on common descent and variation. Social Darwinism twisted biological concepts into moral arguments, suggesting that dominance reflected natural superiority. These distortions had little to do with biology and everything to do with ideology. Eye shape, like other visible traits, became entangled in these narratives. It was no longer just a feature, it was a symbol. It stood in for imagined differences in temperament or ability. These associations were repeated often enough that they began to feel natural, even though they were built on false premises. Once a trait is symbolized in this way, it becomes difficult to discuss neutrally, because the weight of history presses down on every mention. The legacy of colonial classification also influenced how non-European societies were viewed, and sometimes how they came to view themselves. External descriptions filtered inward, shaping self-perception and internal hierarchies. Features that had once been unremarkable could become stigmatized or idealized depending on how they were framed by dominant narratives. This internalization of external judgment is one of colonialism's most enduring effects. Pseudoscience played a key role in giving these narratives a veneer of inevitability. Charts, measurements, and technical language created the illusion of objectivity, but the underlying assumptions went largely unexamined. Samples were small and biased. Conclusions were drawn selectively. Contradictory evidence was ignored. The appearance of rigour masked a lack of genuine inquiry. As genetics and modern anthropology developed, these frameworks began to crumble. Researchers demonstrated that human variation does not fall into discrete categories, that traits overlap extensively, and that most genetic diversity exists within populations rather than between them. Facial features, including eye shape, were shown to be poor indicators of ancestry, and entirely unrelated to intelligence or character. Yet the older ideas did not vanish overnight. Part of the reason is that science moves faster than culture. It can correct itself through evidence and peer review, but cultural narratives persist through habit, tradition, and repetition. Simplified ideas about appearance had been taught for generations. They were embedded in jokes, stereotypes, and assumptions that operated below conscious awareness. Undoing that kind of inheritance takes time. Another reason is that the language of difference remained unchanged even as understanding improved. Words and categories created under colonial frameworks continue to be used, even when their original meanings no longer fit the evidence. This mismatch allowed outdated ideas to survive in new forms. People might reject overt hierarchy, while still relying on the same visual shorthand that once supported it. Media representation also played a role. Early photography and film often presented limited and stereotyped images of non-European populations. These images circulated widely, reinforcing narrow ideas about what people from certain regions looked like. Diversity within groups was rarely shown. Repetition hardened impressions into expectations. The conversation around eye shape has been particularly affected by this history, because the eyes are such a focal point of the face. Features around the eyes are noticed quickly and remembered strongly. When those features are framed as defining or symbolic, they become loaded with meaning that has little to do with biology. This makes it difficult to talk about them casually or scientifically without triggering inherited assumptions. Modern science has worked to disentangle these threads, but the process is ongoing. Anthropologists, geneticists, and historians have shown how earlier classifications were shaped by bias rather than data. They have documented the diversity within populations and traced the complex histories that produced it. Yet public understanding often lags behind these findings, especially when older narratives feel familiar or comfortable. One of the most important corrections modern science offers is context. Features are no longer treated as isolated markers, but as parts of a broader developmental and historical picture. Eye shape is understood as the result of many small influences interacting over time, not as a signal of group essence. This shift replaces judgment with explanation, but only if it is allowed to take root. It is also crucial to recognize that pseudoscience did not fail simply because it was wrong. It failed because it was never truly scientific to begin with. It started with conclusions and worked backward, selecting evidence to fit them. Genuine science does the opposite. It begins with questions, tests hypotheses, and revises conclusions when the data demands it. When applied to human variation, this approach dismantles hierarchy rather than reinforcing it. The distortion of the conversation around physical difference has real consequences. It affects how people are seen and treated. It shapes policies, social dynamics, and personal experiences. Correcting the science without addressing the history leaves part of the problem intact. Understanding where these ideas came from helps explain why they persist and why they are so resistant to simple factual correction. As awareness grows, the conversation slowly changes. There is greater emphasis on diversity within groups, on shared humanity, and on the limits of what appearance can tell us. This does not erase history, but it does offer a way forward that is grounded in evidence rather than ideology. Step into almost any major city in Asia today, and the old mental boxes people once relied on start to fall apart almost immediately. Faces pass by that do not settle neatly into the categories history tried to assign them. Features overlap, blend, and contradict expectations. Someone carries an eye shape associated in popular imagination with one region, a skin tone associated with another, facial structure that reflects yet another lineage entirely. This is not an anomaly or a recent disruption of some ancient order. It is the natural continuation of a process that has always been underway, now simply more visible, more accelerated, and harder to ignore. Modern Asia is defined by movement, not just the dramatic migrations recorded in history books, but everyday movement. People relocating for education, work, family, or safety. Rural populations shifting into cities. Borders opening and closing, sometimes abruptly, sometimes gradually. Transportation shrinking distances that once took months to cross into journeys measured in hours. Each of these changes increases contact, and contact increases mixing. When people mix, so do lineages, and when lineages mix, appearance becomes less predictable in the ways older visual categories depend on. This blending did not begin in the modern era, but modern conditions amplify it. Ancient trade routes already connected large parts of Asia long before the modern world emerged. Merchants, sailors, scholars, and travellers moved between East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Intermarriage followed. Children were born who carried genetic influences from multiple regions, even if those influences were not recognised or labelled at the time. Over generations, these mixed ancestries became ordinary, part of the background of local populations. What has changed is scale and visibility. Today, genetic mixing happens more rapidly and across greater distances. A single city can host people whose ancestors came from dozens of regions, sometimes within the last generation or two. Families form that bridge. Cultures, languages, and appearance patterns that older frameworks treated as separate. The result is not confusion, but complexity. Faces that reflect multiple histories at once, without privileging one over another. This complexity exposes the weakness of old visual shortcuts. When categories were based on limited exposure, they could survive unchallenged. But when everyday reality contradicts them repeatedly, they lose coherence. A person may have an epicanthic fold but not fit any of the other traits historically bundled with it. Another may lack that fold, but share ancestry with populations where it was once common. These combinations force a reconsideration of what those features were ever meant to signify. Modern genetics reinforces this shift. As more people gain access to ancestry testing and genetic research expands, it becomes increasingly clear how mixed many lineages already were, even before recent generations. Results often reveal ancestry from regions that individuals did not expect, precisely because appearance is an unreliable guide. This does not mean the tests are perfect or definitive, but they consistently undermine the idea that visible traits map cleanly onto ancestry. Urbanization plays a particularly powerful role. Cities concentrate diversity. They bring together people who might never have met in earlier eras. In these environments, children grow up seeing a wide range of faces daily. Familiarity increases. The perceptual bias that exaggerates difference weakens. Variation becomes normal rather than noteworthy. Old stereotypes struggle to survive sustained exposure to real diversity. Education and media also shape this landscape. While media has historically reinforced narrow images, it now has the potential to do the opposite. When films, television, and online platforms showcase a broader range of appearances, the mental templates people rely on begin to expand. Representation does not eliminate bias on its own, but it changes what feels familiar, and familiarity matters more than most people realize. Another factor is changing attitudes toward identity itself. Many people no longer feel compelled to define themselves through a single ancestral label. Identity becomes layered rather than singular. Someone may identify culturally with one heritage while acknowledging genetic connections to others. This flexibility weakens the link between appearance and belonging, making it harder to assume that a face tells a complete story. It is also important to recognise that old categories were never truly accurate, even when they felt stable. They were simplifications imposed on a reality that was always more fluid. What modern Asia reveals is not a sudden breakdown of order, but the exposure of complexity that was previously hidden or ignored. The blending we see now did not begin recently. It is simply no longer confined to the margins. Eye shape is a particularly clear example of this blurring. In many parts of Asia, children grow up with classmates whose eye features span a wide range, even within the same neighbourhood. The idea that a particular eye shape defines a group becomes difficult to maintain when lived experience contradicts it daily. Over time, the feature loses its symbolic weight and returns to what it always was biologically, one variation among many. This shift does not erase history. Ancient adaptations, migrations, and isolations still leave traces. Some features remain more common in certain populations due to shared ancestry. But those patterns now exist alongside countless exceptions. The rule no longer dominates perception. The exceptions are too numerous, too ordinary. Mixed lineages also highlight something important about human development. When genetic influences combine in new ways, they do not cancel each other out, they interact. A child may inherit eyelid structure from one ancestor and facial bone structure from another, producing an appearance that does not match any existing category. This is not dilution, it is recombination, a fundamental biological process that increases diversity rather than reducing it. There is sometimes anxiety attached to this blurring, usually rooted in the belief that categories provide stability. When visual categories dissolve, some people feel disoriented, unsure of how to place themselves or others. But biology offers no obligation to preserve categories for comfort. Human variation does not organize itself for ease of classification. It unfolds according to movement, reproduction, and chance. From a scientific perspective, this blurring is entirely expected. Given enough time and enough mixing, populations become more genetically similar overall, even as individual variation remains. This does not lead to sameness, it leads to unpredictability. Faces that cannot be sorted at a glance, features that resist shorthand, diversity expressed at the individual level rather than clustered into groups. Socially, this creates an opportunity. When appearance becomes less useful as a sorting tool, people are forced to rely on other forms of understanding. Behaviour, language, shared experience, and personal interaction take precedence over visual assumption. This does not eliminate prejudice, but it removes one of its most convenient shortcuts. It also encourages a more accurate view of the past. When we see how mixed the present already is, it becomes easier to accept that the past was never as neatly divided as it was portrayed. Ancient populations were not static or isolated by default. They moved, met, and mixed whenever conditions allowed. Modern Asia simply makes that history harder to deny. Another quiet shift is happening at the level of self-perception. Younger generations, exposed to greater diversity and armed with better information, often approach physical difference with less inherited anxiety. Features that once carried social weight may feel neutral or even invisible to them. This does not mean the past has been forgotten, but it does mean its influence is weakening. The blurring of old visual categories does not result in a new set of rigid categories. It resists replacement. The more diverse and mixed populations become, the harder it is to impose new visual rules. This aligns with what biology has always suggested. Variation is continuous. Categories are imposed, not discovered. As this process continues, conversations about appearance inevitably change. Questions shift away from who belongs where and toward how variation arises and persists. The focus moves from classification to understanding. Eye shape becomes one example among many, a feature with history but no fixed meaning, present without needing explanation. Before language ever takes hold, before memory becomes something we can describe, before the world organizes itself into objects and ideas, the human brain is already doing one thing with remarkable intensity. It is searching for faces. Newborn infants, only hours old, will track face-like patterns more readily than almost anything else. 2 dots and a line arranged roughly like eyes, and a mouth are enough to hold their attention. This sensitivity is not learned. It is built in, and it sets the stage for a lifetime in which faces, more than landscapes, tools, or symbols, become the primary way we understand one another. This deep attentiveness to faces explains why discussions about appearance, especially features around the eyes, carry so much weight. The brain does not treat faces as just another category of visual input. They are processed differently, prioritized differently, and remembered differently. When we talk about why people notice eye shape so quickly, or why certain facial differences feel so salient, We're really talking about how the brain evolved to make sense of social life. From a neurological standpoint, faces have dedicated real estate. There is a region of the brain known as the fusiform face area, located in the temporal lobe, that becomes especially active when we look at faces. Damage to this region can result in a condition called prosopagnosia, or face blindness, where a person can see perfectly well but struggles to recognize familiar faces. This alone tells us something important. Face recognition is not a byproduct of general vision. It is a specialized function. The reason for this specialization is straightforward. For humans, survival has always depended heavily on social interaction. Recognizing allies, family members, rivals, and strangers quickly and accurately mattered. Subtle cues in expression, gaze direction, and facial structure provided information about mood, intention, and identity long before words could be exchanged. Over time, brains that were better at reading faces had an advantage, not because they appreciated beauty more, but because they navigated social worlds more effectively. Eyes sit at the center of this system. Gaze direction tells us where attention is focused. Slight changes around the eyes signal emotion, fatigue, alertness, or threat. The brain devotes extraordinary resources to monitoring this area, often without conscious awareness. When someone says they felt watched or sensed a mood shift without knowing why, this facial processing system is usually at work. Because the system is so sensitive, it is also prone to shortcuts. The brain looks for patterns that help it categorize faces quickly. Familiarity becomes a key organizing principle. Faces that resemble those we see often are processed more easily. Faces that differ from that familiar range require more effort. This is not a moral judgment. It is a cognitive one. The brain is optimizing for speed and efficiency, not fairness or accuracy. This is where perception can become misleading. When the brain encounters a face that differs from its most familiar templates, it tends to exaggerate the differences. Individual features stand out more sharply. At the same time, variation within less familiar groups is compressed. People from an unfamiliar group may seem more similar to one another than they actually are, while differences within one's own group appear more nuanced. This effect is well documented in psychological research and is sometimes referred to as the other race effect. The other race effect does not mean people are incapable of recognizing faces from other groups. It means that recognition improves with exposure. When people grow up in diverse environments, their brains build richer, more detailed templates for a wider range of faces. Differences that once stood out sharply begin to feel ordinary. The perceptual system adapts. This adaptability is crucial. It shows that what feels visually obvious is often a reflection of experience rather than inherent difference. Eye shape becomes particularly salient within this framework because it is one of the most variable and expressive regions of the face. Small differences in eyelids, folds, or contours can change how light reflects, how expressions read, and how gaze is interpreted. When the brain is looking for quick cues to categorize a face, these differences become convenient anchors, even if they carry no deeper meaning. Another factor is holistic processing. The brain does not analyze faces feature by feature in isolation. It processes them as integrated wholes. This means that when one feature differs, such as eye shape, it can influence how the entire face is perceived. The difference feels larger than it is because it shifts the overall pattern the brain is trying to match. This holistic processing is efficient, but it also amplifies certain contrasts. Importantly, the brain's face processing system is not static. It is shaped by learning. Cultural context influences which features are emphasized. Media representation plays a role. If certain faces are repeatedly shown as typical or central, the brain treats them as default. Faces that fall outside that narrow representation require more cognitive work to process and are therefore more noticeable. This has consequences. When certain eye features are repeatedly highlighted in caricature, stereotype, or simplified imagery, the brain begins to associate them with categories that feel stable and meaningful. even when they are not. Over time, perception and assumption blur together. The brain is not trying to deceive, it is doing what it evolved to do, simplify a complex world. But without reflection, those simplifications harden. Another layer of facial perception involves emotion. Humans are exceptionally good at reading emotional cues from faces, especially from the eyes. This sensitivity is so strong that we sometimes project emotion where none exists. A neutral face may be interpreted as sad, angry, or distant based on subtle structural features. This phenomenon, known as resting face bias, shows how anatomy can influence perceived emotion without any change in actual feeling. Eye shape can influence these perceptions unintentionally. Certain eyelid configurations may make eyes appear more open or more narrowed at rest. The brain may interpret this as alertness, calmness, or reserve, depending on cultural expectations and individual experience. These interpretations happen quickly, often before conscious thought intervenes. They feel intuitive, but they are not objective. The brain also uses faces to infer trustworthiness, competence, and familiarity, even though research consistently shows that such inferences are unreliable. People form impressions within milliseconds of seeing a face. These impressions can influence behavior, from who we approach to how we interpret ambiguous actions. Again, this is not because faces contain this information, but because the brain evolved to make rapid judgments in uncertain situations. In ancestral environments, these snap judgments may have offered some advantage. In modern contexts, they often misfire. Features that are biologically neutral become socially loaded simply because they are easy to notice. Eye shape, being both salient and variable, becomes an easy target for these projections. Another important aspect of face perception is memory. Faces are encoded in memory differently from other objects. We remember faces in relation to other faces, building a mental map of variation. When that map is narrow, differences feel larger. When it is broad, differences feel smaller. This is why exposure matters so much. The more faces the brain learns to recognize, the more precise its categories become, and the less it relies on crude shortcuts. There is also a strong emotional component to face recognition. Faces are tied to identity, attachment, and social belonging. From infancy onward, faces are associated with care, threat, comfort, and communication. This emotional weight makes facial differences feel more significant than differences in less socially loaded traits. We do not build identity around ear shape or elbow length, but faces carry symbolic meaning whether we intend them to or not. This symbolism is reinforced by social feedback. People respond to faces, comment on them, and attribute meaning to them. Over time, individuals learn how their own faces are read by others. This can shape self-perception and behavior, even though the original perceptions were based on cognitive shortcuts rather than objective truths. Understanding what the brain is actually doing helps diffuse some of the tension around appearance. It reminds us that noticing difference is not a personal failure or a moral flaw. It is a built-in tendency. What matters is what happens next. Whether we accept the brain's first impression as fact, or whether we pause and allow experience, knowledge, and reflection to refine perception. The brain is capable of updating its templates. It can learn to see more nuance. It can stop overemphasizing a single feature once that feature loses its novelty. This adaptability is one of our strengths. It means that perception is not destiny. It changes with context. As societies become more visually diverse, the brain's shortcuts are challenged. Old patterns break down. Features that once stood out fade into the background. This is not because differences disappear, but because the brain stops treating them as exceptional. Normalization happens at the perceptual level before it happens at the conceptual one. Eye shape, in this sense, is not just a biological trait. It is a test case for how perception works. It reveals how quickly the brain categorizes, how strongly it relies on familiarity, and how easily meaning can be projected onto neutral variation. By understanding this process, we gain the ability to interrupt it. At some point, often without realizing it, people learn to look at difference as something that asks for an explanation, rather than something that simply exists. A face looks unfamiliar, and the mind reaches for a reason. A feature stands out, and a story rushes in to fill the gap. This reflex feels natural because it is fast, efficient, and deeply practiced. But it is not inevitable. Just as the brain learned to make assumptions, it can learn to pause. And in that pause, something shifts. Difference stops being a puzzle to solve or a signal to decode and becomes an invitation to observe. Curiosity and assumption may feel similar on the surface, but they move in opposite directions. Assumption closes a question before it is fully formed. It fills uncertainty with inherited ideas, cultural shortcuts, or half-remembered narratives. Curiosity does the opposite. It leaves space open. It acknowledges that there is more to know, and that what is visible is only one layer of a much larger story. When it comes to human variation, especially visible traits like eye shape, that distinction matters more than most people realize. Assumption tends to flatten. It takes a complex individual and compresses them into a category. That category may feel descriptive, but it often carries unspoken implications about background, behavior, or belonging. Curiosity resists that compression. It recognizes that visible traits are outcomes, not explanations. They are results of biology and history, not summaries of a person. One reason assumption feels so comfortable is that it aligns with how the brain likes to operate. As discussed earlier, perception relies on shortcuts. These shortcuts are not inherently malicious. They exist to help us navigate a crowded social world quickly. But speed comes at a cost. When shortcuts go unexamined, they harden into beliefs that feel self-evident simply because they are familiar. Curiosity interrupts that process. It introduces a moment of friction. Instead of asking, "What does this feature mean?" Curiosity asks, "What do I actually know here, and what am I filling in?" That question alone can dissolve a surprising amount of certainty. Seeing variation with curiosity does not mean pretending differences are invisible. It does not require denying that features vary across individuals and populations. In fact, it requires the opposite. It asks us to notice variation more carefully, not less, to see how features differ subtly rather than lumping them together, to recognize that two people who share one visible trait may differ in many others, and that those differences matter just as much. This kind of observation takes practice because it goes against the grain of how difference has often been discussed historically. For a long time, variation was treated as evidence of type, of origin, of rank. Even when those ideas are consciously rejected, their structure lingers. People may no longer believe in hierarchy, yet still feel an impulse to categorize quickly. Curiosity softens that impulse. Another important aspect of curiosity is humility. It accepts that appearance does not grant access to someone's full history. A face does not reveal migration paths, genetic percentages, or cultural identity. It does not tell you how someone was raised, what languages they speak, or how they understand themselves. Assuming otherwise is not just inaccurate. It places undue weight on surface features that were never meant to carry that load. Eye shape is a particularly useful lens for examining this shift, because it has been so heavily burdened with meaning in the past. When someone chooses curiosity instead of assumption, the feature loses its symbolic role. It becomes what it always was biologically, a variation in soft tissue and bone shaped by development and history. Once stripped of symbolic weight, it no longer demands interpretation. Curiosity also changes how people relate to their own appearance. Many individuals grow up absorbing assumptions about what their features are supposed to signify. These assumptions can shape self-image in subtle ways, sometimes leading people to feel that their faces are read incorrectly or incompletely by others. When curiosity replaces assumption, it creates space for self-definition. Appearance no longer feels like a script written in advance. There is a social dimension to this as well. When curiosity becomes the default response to difference, conversations change. Instead of speaking about groups as if they were uniform, people become more precise. They notice diversity within communities rather than reducing them to a single look. This precision weakens stereotypes because stereotypes rely on generalization to function. Curiosity does not require constant questioning or interrogation. It does not mean asking people to explain themselves or their features. In fact, true curiosity is often quiet. It resides in the decision not to jump to conclusions, not to attach meaning where none has been offered. It is an internal stance rather than an external performance. One of the challenges in adopting this stance is discomfort with uncertainty. Assumptions feel reassuring because they create the illusion of understanding. Curiosity leaves questions open, and open questions can feel unsettling. But biology itself is full of open-ended processes. Variation does not resolve into final answers. It continues. Learning to sit with that uncertainty is part of seeing human diversity accurately. Another barrier is the idea that noticing difference automatically leads to division. This fear can push people toward pretending differences do not exist at all. But erasing difference is not the same as understanding it. Curiosity allows difference to exist without hierarchy. It acknowledges variation without turning it into a problem that needs fixing or explaining away. From a scientific perspective, curiosity aligns far better with what we actually know about human variation. Biology does not offer clean categories. It offers overlapping distributions. Genetics does not draw boundaries around faces. It reveals gradients. Development does not aim for uniformity. It produces a range of outcomes. When curiosity guides perception, it mirrors these realities instead of fighting them. Curiosity also invites historical awareness. Instead of assuming that a feature has a single meaning, it opens the door to asking how that feature came to be common in some places and not others, without attaching value judgments. It allows for explanations rooted in migration, environment, and chance rather than in imagined essences. This shift has practical consequences. In healthcare, for example, assumptions based on appearance can lead to miscommunication or oversight. Recognizing variation without overgeneralization improves accuracy. In education, it helps prevent the subtle reinforcement of stereotypes. In everyday interactions, it reduces the friction that comes from being misread. There is also an ethical dimension. Treating variation with curiosity respects individuality. It acknowledges that no one owes an explanation for how they look. It resists turning people into representatives of categories they did not choose. This respect does not come from politeness alone. It comes from understanding how little appearance actually tells us. Curiosity reshapes attention. Instead of fixating on a single feature, it broadens the field of view. A face becomes more than an assemblage of traits to be decoded. It becomes part of a living, moving person whose identity unfolds through interaction rather than inspection. This shift sounds simple, but it runs counter to centuries of habit. Importantly, curiosity is learnable. It grows with exposure. The more varied the faces someone encounters, the less any single feature stands out as defining. This is not because difference disappears, because it becomes contextualized. Variation becomes expected rather than exceptional. Modern environments, especially diverse urban settings, accelerate this learning. Children who grow up surrounded by many different faces often develop more flexible perceptual templates. They are less likely to overemphasize one feature because no single pattern dominates their experience. Curiosity becomes default, assumption less so. Media can either reinforce or undermine this process. When representation is narrow, it feeds assumption. When it is broad and nuanced, it feeds curiosity. Seeing a wide range of appearances associated with a wide range of roles weakens the link between feature and expectation. Choosing curiosity also means being willing to revise one's perceptions. It accepts that first impressions are provisional, not definitive. This does not require suppressing perception, only contextualizing it. The brain still notices difference, but the mind decides what to do with that information. In the context of eye shape, this approach dissolves many of the questions people think they're asking. Instead of wondering why a feature exists, curiosity recognizes that variation does not need justification. It exists because human development allows it, because history carried it forward, and because nothing removed it. That is enough. Over time, curiosity changes the emotional tone of difference. What once felt charged begins to feel neutral. What once felt defining begins to feel incidental. This does not erase identity or history. It simply stops overloading appearance with meaning it was never meant to carry. When you step back far enough that individual features stop demanding attention and patterns begin to soften, difference starts to look less like a mystery and more like a record. Not a record in the sense of something deliberately written down, but one that accumulated quietly, line by line, through movement, climate, chance, and time. Human faces in this view are not statements, they are traces. They carry no intention, no message, no hierarchy. They simply reflect where bodies have been, what conditions shaped them, and how life continued forward without ever pausing to explain itself. Eye shape, which began this entire conversation as something people notice quickly and often misunderstand, settles into a very different role here. It becomes one detail among many, one small outcome of processes that operate everywhere in the human species. It is no longer something that needs decoding. It is something that can be observed, contextualized, and then allowed to exist without commentary. That shift alone changes the emotional weight the feature carries. If difference is a record, then every face is a kind of map. Not a precise one, not something that can be read cleanly or definitively, but a layered one. Some lines were drawn by ancient climates that no longer exist. Others trace migrations that happened so long ago they survive only in genes and bones. Still others reflect more recent mixing, the quiet merging of lineages that history books never bothered to record. None of these lines point in a single direction. None of them end at the same place. Climate left marks, but never instructions. Cold winds did not demand a specific face. Bright snow did not design an eyelid. They simply interacted with bodies that already varied, nudging probabilities slightly over long stretches of time. When those environments changed, the faces did not revert or update. They continued forward, carrying old conditions into new contexts. This is why modern faces can reflect ancient worlds. Biology remembers longer than culture. Journeys matter just as much. Humans are a moving species. Even populations that appear settled today are the result of countless earlier movements. Some were slow drifts, others were sudden displacements. Some were voluntary, others were forced. All of them contributed to the distribution of traits we see now. Faces did not evolve in place. They travelled, mixed, paused, and travelled again. Time ties all of this together. Not time as measured by clocks or calendars, but time as accumulation. Generation after generation, small variations persisted simply because nothing erased them. Development repeated itself with slight differences each time. Genes recombined. Populations expanded and contracted. No moment was decisive on its own. Meaning emerges only when you look across spans too long for any single life to feel. Seen this way, difference stops feeling like a divergence from some imagined norm and starts feeling like continuity. The same processes that produced one face produced all faces. The same developmental rules apply everywhere. The same genetic toolkit is shared across the species. Variation is not a departure from humanity. It is how humanity expresses itself. This perspective also strips away the idea that difference demands explanation in a moral or social sense. Biology does not ask why one outcome occurred instead of another. It does not justify. It does not apologize. It does not rank. It simply unfolds. When we try to impose meaning onto that unfolding, we are adding something that was never there to begin with. Much of the tension around appearance comes from forgetting this. When difference is treated as a signal, people feel compelled to interpret it. When it is treated as a record, interpretation gives way to understanding. The feature does not point beyond itself. It points backward into history, environment, and development, none of which carry judgment. This does not mean that difference is insignificant. It means it is significant in a different way than we were taught. It matters not because it divides people into types, but because it demonstrates how adaptable, flexible, and interconnected humans are. The fact that such a wide range of faces can exist within a single species without compromising function or capacity is remarkable. It speaks to resilience rather than separation. Modern life often obscures this record. Artificial environments dull the influence of climate. Global movement blurs older patterns. Technology compresses distance. Yet the traces remain, not as relics, but as living variation. Faces continue to carry history forward even as new layers are added. The record is never complete. It is always being updated. Understanding difference this way also reframes identity. Appearance no longer needs to anchor who someone is or where they belong. It becomes one thread among many, not a definition. People are free to define themselves through culture, language, values, and experience without being overshadowed by assumptions attached to their features. Biology does not contradict this freedom. It supports it by refusing to fix meaning in place. There is something grounding in realizing that the human story does not converge toward uniformity or split into permanent branches. It flows, it overlaps, it folds back on itself. Features appear, persist, fade, and reappear elsewhere. Similarities emerge without coordination. Differences remain without explanation. The pattern is not chaos, but it is not order in the way humans often expect. When people ask for the real reason Asian eye shapes are so different, they are often looking for a single answer that ties everything together neatly. But the real answer is that there is no single reason, because difference itself is not a problem to be solved. It is the outcome of many ordinary processes acting over extraordinary lengths of time. Climate, migration, development, genetics, perception, and history all played their part, none of them in isolation, none of them with intent. What remains once that is understood is quieter than an explanation. It is a recognition. Faces are not messages. They are memories without words. They record where humanity has been, not where it should go. When we stop asking them to mean more than that, they begin to feel lighter, less burdened by expectation. And perhaps that is the most useful place to let this conversation rest, not with a conclusion that closes the door, but with a way of seeing that stays open. Difference does not point forward or backward in a hierarchy. It stretches outward, across time and space, connecting people through shared processes rather than separating them through imagined categories. The human face, in all its variation, continues to change even now, shaped by movements still unfolding, climates still shifting, and lives still being lived. That record is ongoing, and so is the opportunity to notice it with clarity rather than assumption, allowing difference to exist as evidence of journey rather than as something that needs to be explained away.